Marcus Thompson adjusted his civilian clothes as he walked through the doors of Dragon's Den Martial Arts Academy. The 28-year-old Royal Guard had been protecting members of the British royal family for 3 years, but nobody in this bustling Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu gym knew about his prestigious job. He had deliberately chosen a gym far from his usual haunts, wanting to learn this ground-fighting art without the weight of his reputation or the curious stares that came with his uniform. The academy buzzed with activity on this Tuesday evening. Students in white, blue, and black belts rolled across the mats, their grunts and the sound of bodies hitting the floor creating a symphony of combat. Marcus had done his research about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, understanding it was often called the gentle art, despite its effectiveness in real combat situations. His military background had given him experience in hand-to-hand combat, but he recognized the gaps in his ground-fighting skills. As he approached the front desk, a friendly receptionist named Sarah smiled at him. She handed him a waiver form and explained the gym's rules. Marcus noticed several students glancing in his direction, their eyes sizing him up as they often did with newcomers. He was used to being evaluated, though usually by security teams and royal protection specialists rather than martial artists in colorful belts. The head instructor, Professor Carlos Silva, emerged from the back office. The 45-year-old Brazilian had been teaching jiu-jitsu for over 2 decades and possessed the kind of quiet confidence that came from years of mastering his craft. Carlos shook Marcus's hand and began explaining the fundamentals of the art. He spoke about leverage, technique over strength, and how a smaller person could defeat a larger opponent through superior positioning and knowledge. Marcus nodded politely, though internally he wondered how much of this technique over strength philosophy would actually work in real-world situations. His training as a Royal Guard had emphasized quick, decisive action and the ability to neutralize threats rapidly. The idea of rolling around on the ground for extended periods seemed impractical for his line of work, but he was here to learn and expand his skill set. Professor Silva introduced Marcus to the other students. There was Jake, a 22-year-old college student with a blue belt who worked part-time at a coffee shop. Lisa, a 35-year-old accountant with a purple belt who had been training for 6 years. Miguel, a construction worker with a brown belt who had competed in several local tournaments. And then there was David Chen, the gym's star student and only black belt besides the professor. David was 31 years old, stood about 5'10", and weighed around 170 pounds. He had been training for 12 years and had won multiple championships at the state and regional level. His black belt was worn and frayed from years of use, a testament to his dedication to the art. Other students looked at David with obvious respect and admiration. When he demonstrated techniques, everyone gathered around to watch and learn. As Marcus changed into his borrowed white GI, he overheard conversations among the other students. They spoke about David's latest competition victory, his smooth technique, and his ability to submit opponents who had been training for years. There was an almost mythical quality to how they described his skills, as if he possessed some secret knowledge that separated him from ordinary practitioners. The warm-up began with basic movements. Marcus followed along as the class performed shrimping, bridging, and forward and backward rolls. His athletic background served him well during these exercises, and he kept pace with the more experienced students. However, he noticed several people watching him with barely concealed amusement. His movements were functional, but lacked the fluid grace that came from years of specific jiu-jitsu training. During the technique portion of class, Professor Silva demonstrated an armbar from the guard position. Marcus was paired with Jake, the blue belt, who seemed friendly enough but spoke with a slight condescending tone when explaining the finer points of the technique. Jake's corrections were technically accurate, but they came with subtle implications that Marcus was just another beginner who would need months to understand even basic concepts. As they practiced the technique, Marcus heard whispered conversations from nearby pairs of training partners. Some students speculated about his background, noting his obvious physical fitness but questioning whether he had any real fighting experience. One student mentioned that new people often thought they could rely on strength and athleticism, only to be humbled by technique and experience. The drilling portion revealed both Marcus's strengths and weaknesses. His coordination and body awareness allowed him to pick up the mechanics of techniques relatively quickly. But he lacked the subtle understanding of timing and pressure, that separated beginners from advanced students. When attempting to escape from bottom positions, he would use muscle and force rather than the efficient movements that Jiu-Jitsu emphasized. David Chen worked with various partners throughout the class, and Marcus observed his movement patterns carefully. The black belt seemed to flow from position to position without wasted motion, always appearing to be one step ahead of his training partners. When demonstrating techniques, David's explanations were clear and detailed, but Marcus detected a hint of superiority in his voice when addressing lower-ranked students. As the formal instruction period ended, Professor Silva announced that they would finish class with some light sparring rounds. New students typically observed for their first few sessions, but Marcus felt confident enough in his general grappling abilities to participate. Several students exchanged knowing looks when he expressed interest in joining the sparring session. Marcus's first round was with Lisa, the purple belt accountant. Despite her smaller size and unassuming appearance, she quickly demonstrated the effectiveness of proper technique over raw athleticism. Within minutes, she had swept Marcus to his back and secured a dominant position. Her movements were economical and purposeful, while his responses were predictable and energy-consuming. The round ended with Lisa applying a gentle but inescapable choke, tapping Marcus for his first official submission in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. The pattern continued through several more rounds. Each training partner, regardless of their size or apparent physical strength, was able to control and submit Marcus with relative ease. Their superior technical knowledge allowed them to neutralize his strength and exploit his lack of positional awareness. By the end of the sparring session, Marcus had been tapped multiple times but had failed to secure a single submission of his own. As students began removing their GIs and preparing to leave, Marcus overheard more conversations about his performance. The tone had shifted from mere curiosity to barely concealed mockery. Students commented on how he had spazzed out during rolls, used too much strength, and showed classic beginner mistakes. Some laughed about how he had tried to muscle his way out of submissions instead of using proper escape techniques. David Chen approached Marcus as he was gathering his borrowed equipment. The black belt's demeanor was friendly on the surface, but his words carried an undertone of superiority. He complimented Marcus on his effort, while simultaneously pointing out fundamental errors in his approach. David suggested that Marcus should focus on learning basic positions before attempting to spar with more experienced students, implying that his eagerness to roll had been somewhat presumptuous for a complete beginner. Marcus drove home that evening with mixed feelings about his first jiu-jitsu experience. The techniques were undeniably effective, but the atmosphere at Dragon's Den Academy had left him unsettled. He was accustomed to training environments built on mutual respect and professionalism, where ego took a backseat to skill development and team cohesion. The subtle mockery and condescending attitudes he had encountered were foreign to his usual training experiences. Over the next several weeks, Marcus continued attending classes twice per week. His improvement was steady but unremarkable by the academy standards. He learned to execute basic techniques with reasonable competency and began understanding fundamental concepts like base, posture, and leverage. However, his progress seemed to amuse rather than impress his training partners, who continued treating him like a perpetual beginner despite his obvious athleticism and quick learning ability. The mockery became more pronounced as time passed. Jake, the blue belt coffee shop worker, developed a habit of offering unsolicited advice in a patronizing tone that suggested Marcus was lucky to receive wisdom from someone so experienced. During partner drilling, Jake would demonstrate techniques with exaggerated precision, as if Marcus were incapable of understanding subtle details without overly simplified explanations. Lisa, the purple belt accountant, began making comments about how strength-based fighters always struggled to adapt to jiu-jitsu's technical demands. She would reference Marcus's tendency to use muscle when technique would be more appropriate, often loud enough for other students to hear and nod in agreement. Her critiques were technically accurate, but delivered with an air of superiority that made them feel more like public corrections than helpful coaching. Miguel, the brown belt construction worker, took a different approach to expressing his disdain. He would pair with Marcus during sparring and methodically work through various submission sequences, treating him like a compliant training dummy rather than an active opponent. Miguel's technique was impressive, but his attitude suggested he viewed these sessions as opportunities to showcase his skills against someone who posed no real challenge. The worst treatment came from David Chen, whose initial friendliness had given way to barely concealed contempt. The black belt began making subtle jokes about Marcus's technique during group discussions, often using him as an example of common beginner mistakes. David's comments were never directly insulting, but they consistently positioned Marcus as the class dunce who served as a cautionary tale for other students. David's behavior extended beyond mere verbal jabs. During sparring sessions, he would often call Marcus over for demonstration purposes, using him to show specific techniques to the class. These demonstrations always cast Marcus in the role of the ineffective defender, who fell victim to superior technique and knowledge. David would explain each step of his attack while Marcus remained trapped in increasingly uncomfortable positions, unable to escape or defend effectively. The other students began following David's lead in their treatment of Marcus. Conversations would pause when he approached groups, then resume with barely suppressed laughter after he moved away. Training partners would exchange knowing looks when Marcus made technical errors, as if his mistakes confirmed their preconceived notions about his abilities and understanding. Marcus found himself becoming the subject of academy folklore. Students would reference his previous mistakes when teaching newer members, using his errors as examples of what not to do. His name became shorthand for the kind of strength-based, technique-deficient approach that represented everything wrong with traditional martial arts backgrounds in a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu context. The psychological pressure began affecting Marcus's performance during training sessions. He became hesitant to attempt techniques, knowing that mistakes would be scrutinized and discussed. His natural aggression and decisive nature, assets in his professional life, became liabilities in an environment where he felt constantly judged and found wanting. The confident royal guard who protected some of the world's most important people was slowly being transformed into a self-conscious beginner who second-guessed every movement. Despite the hostile social environment, Marcus continued training because he recognized the technical value of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. His professional responsibilities required him to stay current with effective fighting methods, and he understood that ground fighting skills could prove crucial in real-world protection scenarios. He studied instructional videos during his off hours, analyzed competition footage, and practiced movements at home to accelerate his development. Marcus's dedication to improvement outside of class began paying dividends. Though the progress was subtle and largely unnoticed by his training partners, his escape timing improved, his submissions became tighter, and his positional awareness grew more sophisticated. However, these advances were overshadowed by the established narrative of his incompetence that had taken root among the academy's student body. The breaking point came during a particularly humiliating class session. Professor Silva had stepped out to handle administrative duties, leaving David Chen in charge of instruction. David decided to use this opportunity to demonstrate advanced guard passing techniques, and he called Marcus to the center of the mat to serve as his training dummy. What followed was 10 minutes of systematic humiliation as David worked through his entire guard passing system while providing running commentary about Marcus's defensive failures. Each escape attempt was effortlessly countered, each defensive posture was easily broken, and each moment of resistance was met with superior technique and positioning. The other students gathered in a circle to watch and learn, their expressions ranging from educational interest to barely concealed amusement. David's commentary became increasingly condescending as the demonstration progressed. He began making jokes about how Marcus's approach represented everything that was wrong with traditional martial arts training. He suggested that Marcus's background, whatever it might be, had actually hindered his jiu-jitsu development by teaching him to rely on attributes rather than technique. The final insult came when David suggested that Marcus should consider taking private lessons before continuing with group classes, implying that his presence was holding back the development of other students. The comment drew chuckles from several observers and created an awkward silence that lasted until Professor Silva returned to resume normal instruction. As class ended that evening, Marcus overheard a conversation between Jake and Miguel near the equipment storage area. They were discussing his performance and questioning whether he had any real fighting experience at all. Jake suggested that Marcus was probably one of those people who talked big about their martial arts background, but had never actually been tested in real situations. Miguel agreed, adding that plenty of people claimed military or law enforcement experience without having any genuine combat training. The conversation stung because it was so far from the truth. Marcus's professional life involved constant threat assessment, tactical planning, and the kind of life-or-death decision-making that most people would never experience. His training regimen included regular sessions with world-class instructors in various combat disciplines, weapons handling, and protection methodologies. The idea that these college students and weekend warriors questioned his legitimate fighting experience was both infuriating and motivating. David Chen approached Marcus as he was leaving the academy that evening. The black belt's expression was mock-sympathetic as he offered additional unsolicited advice about Marcus's training approach. David suggested that Marcus might be more suited to a different martial art, perhaps something that relied more heavily on strength and less on technical precision. The implication was clear. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu might be too sophisticated for someone with Marcus's limitations. That night, Marcus sat in his apartment reviewing the evening's events and feeling a frustration he rarely experienced in his professional life. As a Royal Guard, he was accustomed to being respected for his skills, trusted with enormous responsibilities, and valued as a crucial member of elite security teams. The contrast with his treatment at Dragon's Den Academy was stark and increasingly unbearable. Marcus decided to take a different approach to his jiu-jitsu development. Rather than relying solely on the academy's instruction, he began seeking out additional training resources and opportunities to accelerate his learning. His position as a Royal Guard provided him access to some of the world's most elite training facilities and instructors, though he would need to be careful about maintaining his cover story. Through professional contacts, Marcus arranged private sessions with a former Special Air Service operative named Tony Richards, who had extensive Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu experience. Tony had earned his black belt while serving in various conflict zones, where ground fighting skills had proven essential for survival. Unlike the sport-focused approach at Dragon's Den Academy, Tony's instruction emphasized the brutal efficiency and practical application that Marcus craved. Tony's garage gym looked nothing like the polished academy where Marcus had been suffering through weeks of humiliation. The mats were worn and stained from years of serious training, and the walls displayed photos of Tony with various special forces units rather than tournament trophies and colorful belts. The atmosphere was purely functional, designed for developing real fighting skills rather than sporting achievements or social hierarchies. During their first private session, Tony quickly identified the gaps in Marcus's training that went beyond simple technical knowledge. The academy had been teaching him sport jiu-jitsu rules and point-scoring techniques, but they had neglected the psychological warfare and mental toughness that separated casual practitioners from serious fighters. Tony explained that Marcus's real problem wasn't his technique, it was his acceptance of the victim role that his training partners had assigned to him. Tony's teaching methodology was radically different from Professor Silva's approach, where the academy emphasized patient technical development and gradual progression through belt ranks. Tony focused on developing an aggressive, submission-hunting mindset that treated every training session like a real fight. He taught Marcus to view jiu-jitsu not as a gentle art of leverage and timing, but as a violent chess match where the objective was to break the opponent's will along with their body. The private sessions revealed aspects of Marcus's fighting ability that had been dormant during his academy training. When freed from the social dynamics and subtle psychological pressure of group classes, his natural aggression and tactical intelligence began to emerge. Tony pushed him to trust his instincts and fighting experience rather than overthinking every movement according to textbook technique. Marcus began incorporating Tony's lessons into his academy training, though he was careful not to reveal the dramatic improvement in his understanding and application of jiu-jitsu principles. He continued playing the role of the struggling beginner while secretly developing a much more sophisticated game plan. His escapes became more timely and effective. His attacks grew more threatening and his overall positioning improved significantly. The other students at Dragon's Den Academy remained oblivious to Marcus's rapid development because their preconceived notions about his abilities prevented them from recognizing his progress. They continued treating him like a hopeless beginner, even as his performance during sparring sessions became noticeably more competitive. Their blind spots and arrogance were creating opportunities for Marcus to study their games and develop counters to their favorite techniques. David Chen, in particular, had become predictable in his approach to rolling with Marcus. The black belt had developed a routine of demonstrating specific techniques and combinations using Marcus as his practice dummy, always following similar patterns and setups. David's confidence in his superiority had made him careless about varying his attacks or adapting to Marcus's gradually improving defensive skills. Marcus began to notice technical flaws in David's game that the black belt's success at the academy level had allowed him to ignore. David's guard passing relied heavily on strength and aggression, rather than the technical precision he claimed to value. His submission attempts often relied on his opponent's compliance, rather than truly inescapable technique. Most importantly, David had never learned to handle opponents who refused to accept the psychological dominance he tried to establish. The revelation that David was more vulnerable than his reputation suggested gave Marcus a new perspective on the entire academy hierarchy. These students had been successful in their limited competitive environment, but none of them had faced the kind of life or death pressure that Marcus dealt with professionally. Their technical knowledge was impressive within the context of sport jiu-jitsu, but it lacked the mental toughness and adaptability required for real combat situations. Marcus began planning his eventual response to the months of humiliation and disrespect he had endured. Rather than simply improving his performance gradually, he decided to orchestrate a dramatic demonstration that would expose the gap between his training partner's perceptions and reality. The plan required patience and careful execution, but the psychological impact would be worth the wait. Tony's training intensified as Marcus prepared for his revenge. They worked specifically on the techniques and scenarios that Marcus would likely encounter when he finally decided to show his true abilities. Tony taught him to be ruthless in his application of submissions, to ignore his opponent's tapping signals just long enough to make his point, and to maintain the kind of relentless pressure that broke lesser fighters both physically and mentally. The psychological preparation was as important as the technical training. Tony helped Marcus develop the mental framework necessary to shift from his current passive role to that of a dominant predator. This transformation required Marcus to access the same mindset he used in his professional life, where hesitation could mean the difference between life and death for the people under his protection. Marcus also began studying his training partners' games more systematically, identifying their favorite techniques, preferred positions, and defensive habits. He paid particular attention to David Chen's patterns, noting that the black belt always attempted the same guard pass sequence when working from standing positions and favored a specific arm triangle setup when achieving side control. The waiting became the most difficult part of Marcus's plan. Every class session required him to maintain his facade of technical incompetence while enduring continued mockery and condescension from students who had no idea they were dealing with a highly trained professional fighter. The acting required was more challenging than any physical technique he had learned. As weeks passed, Marcus's performance during rolling sessions began to show subtle improvements that his training partners attributed to natural learning progression rather than intensive private instruction. He would occasionally escape from dominant positions or defend against submission attempts for longer periods, but always in ways that seemed consistent, with gradual beginner development rather than dramatic skill acquisition. The academy students' continued arrogance and dismissive attitude toward Marcus created the perfect setup for his planned revelation. They had become so comfortable with their perceived superiority that they had stopped taking him seriously as a potential threat. David Chen, in particular, had grown increasingly casual in his approach to sparring with Marcus, treating their training sessions more like technical demonstrations than genuine competitive matches. Marcus knew that his opportunity was approaching, and he began to feel the familiar pre-mission excitement that preceded his most important professional assignments. The difference was that this time, the stakes were personal rather than professional, and the satisfaction of success would be entirely his own. 3 months had passed since Marcus's first humiliating class at Dragon's Den Academy, and the social dynamics had solidified into a comfortable routine for everyone except him. The other students had grown accustomed to using him as their designated practice dummy, someone whose presence made them feel skilled and accomplished by comparison. Marcus had become the Academy's unofficial comic relief, the struggling beginner whose mistakes provided entertainment and teaching moments for more advanced practitioners. The Academy was preparing for its quarterly in-house tournament, a casual competition that allowed students to test their skills against training partners in a more structured environment. Professor Silva announced that participation was optional but encouraged, as it provided valuable experience and helped identify areas for improvement. The tournament would include divisions based on experience level, with separate brackets for beginners, intermediate, and advanced competitors. David Chen was expected to dominate the advanced division, as he had done in previous tournaments. His combination of technical skill, competition experience, and psychological dominance had made him virtually unbeatable within the Academy's student body. Other competitors respected his abilities and often seemed defeated before their matches even began, their body language revealing resignation rather than competitive confidence. Marcus had been training with Tony Richards for several weeks now, and his transformation had been remarkable. The private sessions had unlocked aspects of his fighting ability that the Academy's social environment had suppressed, revealing a natural aptitude for combat that went far beyond what his training partners imagined. Tony had helped him develop not just technical skills, but the predatory mindset necessary to exploit his opponent's weaknesses ruthlessly. The decision to enter the tournament came suddenly during a particularly frustrating class session. David had again used Marcus for a technical demonstration, this time showing the class how to counter various escape attempts from side control. The demonstration involved Marcus being repeatedly flattened and controlled, while David provided commentary about his predictable and ineffective defensive responses. After class, several students approached Marcus with mock encouragement about entering the tournament. Jake suggested that competing would be a great learning experience, even though Marcus would obviously lose his first-round match quickly. Lisa added that tournaments helped beginners understand the difference between training room technique and competitive application. Miguel noted that Marcus would probably be nervous, but that getting submitted quickly would at least minimize his embarrassment. David Chen's suggestion was the most condescending of all. He recommended that Marcus consider competing in the beginner division, where he might have a chance of winning at least one match. David explained that success at his current skill level would build confidence and encourage continued training, implying that expectations should be kept appropriately low for someone with Marcus's limitations. The combined effect of these conversations was to crystallize Marcus's resolve. He would enter the tournament, but not in the beginner division as David had suggested. Instead, he would compete directly against the Academy's best students in the advanced division, where his true abilities could be displayed most dramatically. The psychological impact of his inevitable victory would be maximized by facing opponents who had grown comfortable with their perceived superiority. Marcus informed Professor Silva of his intention to compete in the advanced division, a decision that raised eyebrows throughout the Academy. Silva diplomatically suggested that the intermediate division might be more appropriate, given Marcus's relatively short training time, but Marcus insisted on testing himself against the Academy's highest-level practitioners. Silva reluctantly agreed to allow the entry, though his expression suggested he expected Marcus to be overwhelmed quickly. News of Marcus's tournament entry spread quickly through the Academy's student body, generating a mixture of surprise, amusement, and anticipation. Most students viewed his decision as evidence of unrealistic self-assessment, the kind of ego-driven mistake that beginners often made before being humbled by more experienced competitors. The general consensus was that Marcus would provide entertainment through his inevitable defeat, possibly even getting injured if he encountered an opponent who was less gentle than his usual training partners. David Chen expressed particular amusement at Marcus's tournament ambitions. The black belt made several comments about beginners who confused training room success with competition readiness, noting that the psychological pressure and intensity of tournament matches often exposed technical deficiencies that were hidden during casual sparring sessions. David seemed genuinely excited about the possibility of facing Marcus in competition, viewing it as an opportunity to demonstrate his superiority in a more official setting. The tournament bracket was announced 2 weeks before the event, and Marcus found himself scheduled to face David Chen in the first round of the advanced division. The matchup seemed almost comically unfair to the other students, who began making jokes about how quickly the match would end. Several students started a betting pool about whether Marcus would last longer than 30 seconds, with most putting their money on submission times under 1 minute. Marcus continued his private training sessions with Tony Richards, but now their focus shifted specifically to tournament preparation. Tony helped him develop a game plan tailored to David's known techniques and tendencies, identifying specific opportunities to exploit the black belt's overconfidence and predictable attack patterns. They practiced scenarios repeatedly until Marcus could execute his planned responses automatically, without conscious thought or hesitation. Tony's advice went beyond mere technique to encompass the psychological warfare aspect of competition. He taught Marcus to use his opponent's expectations against them, to appear vulnerable while setting traps, and to maintain perfect emotional control even when dominating an opponent completely. The goal was not just to win, but to deliver such a decisive and humiliating defeat that it would completely restructure the academy's social hierarchy. The final weeks of preparation involved Marcus maintaining his facade of technical incompetence during regular training sessions while secretly refining the specific skills he would need for his tournament match. The deception required careful acting, as any significant improvement in his visible abilities would alert David to the possibility that their upcoming match might be more competitive than expected. Marcus's behavior during sparring sessions became increasingly passive as the tournament approached, allowing himself to be submitted more easily and appearing to struggle with techniques that he could actually execute flawlessly. The performance convinced his training partners that he was experiencing pre-competition anxiety and technical regression, common problems among inexperienced competitors facing their first serious test. David Chen's confidence grew proportionally to Marcus's apparent decline in performance. The black belt began discussing their upcoming match openly, describing it as a teaching opportunity rather than a genuine competition. David spoke about the importance of controlling the pace against nervous beginners and using the match to demonstrate proper technique, rather than simply pursuing the quickest possible submission. Professor Silva approached Marcus privately to express concern about his tournament entry and the potential for injury against a much more experienced opponent. Silva offered to help arrange a match against someone closer to Marcus's apparent skill level, suggesting that the learning experience would be more valuable than a quick defeat against David. Marcus politely declined the intervention, insisting that he wanted to test himself against the academy's best student. The conversation with Professor Silva revealed the extent to which Marcus had successfully concealed his true abilities. Even the head instructor, who had observed his training for months, genuinely believed that Marcus was an enthusiastic but limited beginner who was about to be overwhelmed by superior technique and experience. The deception had been so complete that nobody at the academy suspected the dramatic reversal that was about to unfold. As tournament day approached, Marcus felt the familiar pre-mission calm that preceded his most important professional assignments. The difference was that this time, success would bring personal satisfaction rather than duty fulfillment. After months of enduring mockery and condescension, he was finally ready to reveal his true nature and capabilities to people who had consistently underestimated him. The final training session before the tournament provided one last opportunity for David to demonstrate his perceived superiority. During sparring, the black belt took his time working through various submission attempts against Marcus, providing running commentary about tournament strategy and the importance of remaining calm under pressure. David's advice was technically sound, but delivered with the kind of patronizing tone that made it clear he viewed their upcoming match as a foregone conclusion. Tournament day arrived with an electric atmosphere at Dragon's Den Academy. The training area had been transformed into a competition venue, with designated mat spaces marked by colored tape and chairs arranged around the perimeter for spectators. Students from other local academies had arrived to compete, bringing a sense of legitimacy and excitement that elevated the event beyond a simple in-house training session. Marcus arrived early, observing the setup process and noting the nervous energy that permeated the academy. Competitors warmed up methodically, stretching tight muscles and running through technique sequences with intense focus. The casual atmosphere of regular training sessions had been replaced by pre-competition tension that separated serious competitors from recreational practitioners. David Chen commanded attention from the moment he entered the building. Other competitors recognized his reputation and accomplishments, greeting him with the respect accorded to established champions. His confidence was palpable as he interacted with various students and visitors, clearly comfortable in his role as the tournament's expected dominant force. David's warm-up routine was technically impressive, demonstrating the fluid movement patterns and sophisticated techniques that had made him the Academy's star student. The contrast between David's reception and Marcus's virtual invisibility was stark and deliberate. Most competitors and spectators were unaware of Marcus's existence, and those who knew him from training sessions viewed him as an entertaining sideshow rather than a serious participant. His placement in the advanced division bracket had generated some confusion among visitors who wondered why an obvious beginner had been allowed to compete against experienced practitioners. Professor Silva gathered the advanced division competitors for pre-tournament instructions, reviewing rules and safety protocols, while emphasizing the importance of good sportsmanship and technical execution. Marcus listened carefully while maintaining the slightly overwhelmed expression that people expected from nervous beginners facing their first competition experience. The performance was convincing enough that several competitors offered encouraging words about learning from losses and gaining valuable experience. The tournament format called for single elimination matches with 6-minute time limits. Competitors would be awarded points for achieving dominant positions, with submissions ending matches immediately regardless of time remaining. The rules favored technical execution over physical attributes, theoretically giving smaller, more skilled practitioners advantages over larger, stronger opponents who relied primarily on athletic ability. Marcus's match against David was scheduled as the opening contest of the advanced division, partly for entertainment value, and partly to clear the bracket quickly by eliminating an obvious mismatched competitor. The matchup had generated significant interest among spectators who viewed it as either comedy or a teaching demonstration, depending on their perspective and relationship to the participants. As their match time approached, David approached Marcus with what appeared to be genuine concern for his welfare. The black belt offered last-minute advice about staying calm, breathing properly, and not attempting techniques that were beyond his skill level. David's tone was condescending but not malicious, reflecting his belief that he was being generous by sharing wisdom with someone who was clearly out of his depth. Marcus accepted David's advice graciously while internally preparing for the psychological warfare that would accompany his technical dominance. Tony Richards had taught him that breaking an opponent's confidence was often more important than breaking their body, and that the most devastating victories occurred when superior fighters were forced to acknowledge their inferiority publicly. The months of accumulated humiliation were about to be repaid with interest. The referee called both competitors to the center of the mat for final instructions and the traditional pre-match handshake. David's grip was firm and confident, his eyes reflecting the calm assurance of someone who had never experienced unexpected defeat. Marcus matched his composure while concealing the predatory focus that had been sharpened through years of high-stakes professional training. Spectators gathered around the mat area as the match began, their conversations revealing expectations of a quick and decisive outcome in David's favor. Several students had positioned themselves to get optimal viewing angles for what they anticipated would be a technical demonstration rather than a genuine competition. The atmosphere was relaxed and social, with people treating the match as entertainment rather than serious sport. The referee signaled the start of the match, and both competitors moved toward the center of the mat with measured steps. David's approach was methodical and controlled, reflecting his plan to dominate the match through superior positioning and technique rather than explosive attacks. Marcus moved with equal composure, though his body language suggested nervous anticipation rather than predatory confidence. David initiated contact by attempting to establish grips for his preferred guard passing sequence, the same technique combination that Marcus had studied extensively during private training sessions with Tony Richards. The black belt's movements were technically proficient, but followed predictable patterns that Marcus had learned to counter through repetitive drilling and scenario-based preparation. Marcus, allowed David to establish his initial grips while secretly positioning himself for a counterattack that would exploit the black belt's overconfidence and reliance on opponent compliance. The setup required perfect timing and execution, as any premature movement would alert David to the possibility that his opponent possessed more skill than expected. For the first few seconds of the match, events unfolded exactly as spectators had anticipated. David moved confidently into his attack sequence while Marcus appeared to struggle with the pressure and superior technique of his more experienced opponent. The crowd's relaxed murmur suggested that people were already beginning to lose interest in what seemed like a predictably one-sided contest. David's confidence reached its peak as he transitioned into the guard passing position that had worked effectively against Marcus during countless training sessions. The black belt's body language radiated certainty as he began applying pressure and working through his systematic approach to achieving dominant position. His movements were technically sound but executed with the casual precision of someone who had never encountered serious resistance from this particular opponent. The moment of transformation occurred so quickly that many spectators missed the initial transition. Marcus shifted from passive defense to explosive offense in a movement sequence that bypassed David's established defensive patterns and created an immediate submission opportunity. The technique was not complex, but its execution was flawless and completely unexpected. David's expression changed from confident control to confused alarm as he found himself trapped in a position he had never experienced during their previous training encounters. Marcus's grip was impossibly strong, his positioning was technically perfect, and his transition speed had been far beyond anything a beginner should possess. The black belt attempted his standard escape sequences, but each movement only tightened Marcus's control and brought the submission closer to completion. The crowd's casual chatter died as people realized that something unprecedented was happening on the mat. David Chen, the Academy's unbeatable champion, was being systematically dismantled by someone they had dismissed as a hopeless beginner. The reversal was so dramatic and unexpected that some spectators wondered if David was deliberately allowing the match to continue for teaching purposes. Marcus felt David's resistance weakening as the submission hold tightened with mechanical precision. The black belt's breathing became labored, his movements grew increasingly desperate, and his famous technical composure began to crack under pressure that he had never encountered in competition. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical control, as David realized that his opponent possessed skills that rendered his reputation and experience meaningless. The final seconds of the match unfolded in surreal, slow motion for everyone present. David's attempts to escape became weaker and more frantic, as Marcus maintained perfect control and steadily increased the submission pressure. The black belt's face showed a mixture of physical distress and psychological shock as he confronted the reality that he was about to be defeated by someone he had consistently mocked and underestimated. Marcus applied the finishing pressure with surgical precision, increasing the intensity just enough to force David's submission without causing unnecessary injury. The tap came reluctantly, accompanied by a desperate slapping motion that indicated complete surrender. The match had lasted exactly 13 seconds from start to finish, a time frame so brief that many spectators were still processing what they had witnessed. The immediate aftermath was characterized by stunned silence as everyone present struggled to comprehend what had just occurred. David lay on the mat for several seconds after the submission, his breathing heavy and his expression reflecting complete bewilderment. Marcus stood calmly beside him, showing no signs of exertion or excitement despite having just delivered the most shocking upset in the Academy's history. Professor Silva approached. The aftermath of Marcus's 13-second victory over David Chen created a seismic shift in the atmosphere at Dragon's Den Academy that extended far beyond the tournament itself. Students who had witnessed the impossible upset struggled to process what they had seen, their fundamental assumptions about skill levels and training hierarchies having been completely overturned. The confident social order that had governed the Academy for years lay in ruins, replaced by uncertainty and newfound respect for capabilities that could remain hidden beneath deceptive appearances. Marcus proceeded through the remaining tournament matches with methodical efficiency, dispatching opponents who had suddenly become much more respectful and cautious in their approach. His technique remained consistently excellent, but the psychological advantage gained from his opening victory made subsequent matches almost anticlimactic. Competitors who might have provided serious challenges were already mentally defeated before stepping onto the mat, their confidence shaken by witnessing David's humiliation. The tournament concluded with Marcus claiming the Advanced Division Championship, a result that would have seemed impossible to predict just hours earlier. His victory speech was brief and gracious, thanking Professor Silva for the training opportunity and acknowledging his fellow competitors' skills and sportsmanship. There was no gloating or reference to his previous treatment, just the professional courtesy that characterized his approach to conflict resolution in his regular work environment. David Chen's reaction to his defeat evolved through several stages as the immediate shock gave way to deeper psychological processing. Initially, he had seemed confused and disoriented, unable to reconcile his memories of easily dominating Marcus during training sessions with the reality of being submitted so decisively. The black belt had left the tournament early, claiming illness but clearly seeking escape from the uncomfortable attention and barely concealed amusement of other competitors. In the days following the tournament, word of Marcus's victory spread throughout the local Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu community like wildfire. The story took on mythical proportions as it was retold, with each version adding details about the speed and technical perfection of his submission. Marcus became a local legend, the mysterious beginner who had shocked everyone by revealing world-class skills at the most unexpected moment. The social dynamics at Dragon's Den Academy underwent a complete transformation as students struggled to adjust their behavior toward someone they now knew possessed superior fighting abilities. Jake, the condescending blue belt, became almost obsequiously respectful, offering to help Marcus with anything he might need and apologizing for any previous misunderstandings about his skill level. Lisa, the purple belt accountant, began seeking Marcus's advice about competition strategy and technique refinement. Miguel, the brown belt construction worker, approached Marcus privately to express admiration for his performance and to ask about his training background. The conversation revealed Miguel's genuine curiosity about martial arts development and his respect for legitimate skill, regardless of belt color or academy politics. Marcus appreciated Miguel's straightforward approach and began to see him as a potential training partner rather than another source of condescension. Professor Silva requested a private meeting with Marcus to discuss his future training goals and to better understand his martial arts background. The conversation was respectful and professional, with Silva acknowledging that he had clearly misjudged Marcus's abilities and expressing interest in learning from his approach to technique development. Silva offered advanced training opportunities and suggested that Marcus might consider helping with instruction for newer students. The most dramatic change occurred in David Chen's behavior and status within the academy. The former champion became withdrawn and inconsistent in his training attendance, clearly struggling to rebuild his confidence after such a public and decisive defeat. When David did attend classes, his technique remained solid, but his psychological dominance had been completely shattered. Other students no longer looked to him as the undisputed academy leader, and his advice carried less weight than it had before the tournament. Marcus found himself in the unusual position of being simultaneously celebrated and studied by his training partners. Students who had previously dismissed his abilities now analyzed his technique with intense interest, trying to identify the subtle signs of expertise they had missed during his months of apparent struggle. The attention was flattering but also somewhat uncomfortable, as it interfered with his original goal of training quietly and improving his ground fighting skills. The revelation of Marcus's true abilities raised inevitable questions about his background and training history that he needed to address. Carefully, without compromising his cover story, he developed a plausible narrative about previous military service and extensive martial arts training that satisfied people's curiosity without revealing specific details about his current professional responsibilities. The story was vague enough to discourage follow-up questions while providing sufficient explanation for his demonstrated skills. Marcus's relationship with Tony Richards evolved as well, with their training sessions becoming more focused on advanced competition preparation rather than basic skill development. Tony expressed satisfaction with Marcus's tournament performance and encouraged him to consider competing at higher levels where his skills would be more appropriately challenged. The private instruction continued, but now it served to refine techniques rather than develop fundamental abilities. The broader Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu community's reaction to Marcus's emergence was overwhelmingly positive, with instructors from other academies reaching out to invite him for training sessions and seminars. His reputation as a technically excellent and mentally tough competitor spread quickly, opening opportunities for advanced instruction and competition that he had not anticipated when beginning his jiu-jitsu journey. David Chen eventually returned to regular training, but his role within the academy had been permanently altered. He remained technically skilled and knowledgeable, but his aura of invincibility had been replaced by a more humble and realistic assessment of his abilities. The defeat had been educational in ways that went beyond mere technique, forcing him to confront the limitations of sport-focused training. When faced with opponents who possessed real fighting, experienced the long-term impact of Marcus's revelation extended beyond individual relationships to influence the entire academy's training culture. Students became more respectful of each other's potential, recognizing that appearances could be deceiving and that genuine skill might be hidden beneath modest exteriors. The casual mockery and condescension that had characterized interactions with newer students largely disappeared, replaced by more supportive and professional attitudes. Professor Silva began incorporating lessons from Marcus's example into his instruction, emphasizing the importance of mental toughness and realistic self-assessment alongside technical skill development. The academy's approach became more serious and focused, with less emphasis on social hierarchy and more attention to developing practical fighting abilities. The changes improved the training environment for everyone, creating opportunities for genuine learning and mutual respect. Marcus continued training at Dragon's Den Academy, but now as an acknowledged expert whose presence elevated the skill level and seriousness of every training session. His transformation from academy joke to respected champion served as a permanent reminder that true martial arts ability could not be measured by belt color, tournament trophies, or social status. The Royal Guard, who had endured months of mockery, had ultimately taught his training partners the most valuable lesson of all: never underestimate an opponent, because the quiet professional sitting in the corner might be the most dangerous person in the room. The 13 seconds that changed everything became part of academy folklore, a story told to new students as an example of why humility and respect should guide all training interactions. Marcus had achieved his original goal of improving his ground fighting skills, but the journey had provided much more valuable lessons about human nature, perseverance, and the satisfaction that comes from proving doubters wrong through demonstrated excellence, rather than empty words.